Hi everyone, my name is Kelly McDonald and I am a manager of R&D at Multi Health Systems. I'm really excited to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics when it comes to organizations. Actually, just one of my favorite topics, period, and that is change style preferences. I was introduced to the concept of change style preferences about 8 years ago, and it frames how I think about things in my professional and my personal life. I probably think about and apply my knowledge of change style preferences at least once a week. And it's a really simple yet powerful concept that has a lot of utility for the training industry. And I'm excited to share some of my excitement with you over the next little bit. So in particular, what we're going to do today is I want everyone to understand the importance of change preferences. I want us to chat a little bit about the role of change preferences in leadership. And finally, I want to look at how change preferences can show up in team settings and some activities that can be done to really showcase the power of change preferences in teams. So to kick us off, sometimes when I'm talking about change and change style preferences, I like to actually do a demonstration with the wave. But because we are virtual, I'm just going to ask that we simply think about it. So for context, in case anyone doesn't know, the wave is often done at sports games and it's a chain reaction where as soon as one person or section of the stadium does the wave, the people next to them do it and so on and so forth. And what I really like about this activity is it is a physical representation of how change happens in an organization. So as the first few people are done with the wave and they sit back down, others have not even started yet. With the idea being that sometimes the people who initiate the change, they have had time to process it, they've accepted it, before others in the organization are even aware of the change. And that is quite common. So not only are people hitting the change at different times, like they would be with the wave, they also have different emotions. If I had asked you to actually do the wave, some of you may have been annoyed or frustrated or nervous. Others may have felt enthusiastic and nostalgic about it. So the idea is that different emotions are perfectly natural when experiencing change. And often within organizations, we are not so great at communicating change. So to start us off, what is change? For some, it's an exciting opportunity. For others, it brings uncertainty or discomfort. But at its core, change is the process of moving from one state to another, whether that is personal, organizational, or societal change. And as we know, in today's world, change is constant. And because change is constant, organizations must be adapting to shifting markets, emerging technologies, evolving workplace dynamics. But here's the challenge. While the need for change is universal, our approach to managing change has evolved significantly over time. So let's talk a little bit about that. As organizations and industries have evolved, so too have the models we use to understand and manage change. And so let's take a closer look at how change management models in particular have shifted over time, highlighting just a couple key themes there. So one of the most significant shifts has been this transition from incremental approaches to more iterative and agile frameworks. So early models of change, such as Lewin's, really focused on a linear, step-by-step process, really ideal for environments where change was predictable, slower pace type of change. In contrast, recent models really reflect the need for flexibility in today's fast-paced and unpredictable environment. So they emphasize continuous improvement, adaptability, and a readiness to pivot when necessary, making them much more suited to the complexities that come with the modern organization. Another major evolution is how we consider the human side of change. So early models were really organization-centric. They focused really heavily on structure and processes, essentially viewing change as something that happens at the macro level. But more recent models emphasize the psychological and the emotional aspects of change. So they recognize that successful change begins at an individual level, really addressing how people feel, think, and behave throughout that process. So those are two key takeaways that change management models have really evolved. And I also just want to briefly highlight some of the key conversations that are happening in the change industry right now, because I think they help frame our discussion for today. So one, as we all know, change is the rule, not the exception. So in one survey, 77% of HR practitioners and leaders report that their organization is in a state of constant change. As we talked about with the wave, change is an emotional experience that people react differently to. So when people perceive change as something that is happening to them, as opposed to something that they are a part of, they become resistant. And when people resist change, there are consequences to that. Coaching is one of the most helpful activities for change management. So coaching that brings insights into that people side of change is perceived as one of the most successful ways to implement change management initiatives. And then finally, managers and leaders need to really step up as change agents. The ability to empathetically guide employees through change is no longer a nice to have trait for managers. Leaders and managers need to be able to be the advocates of change for their teams and be clear communicators of changes that are happening within an organization. So long term, there's been lots of great advancements in change management models, great conversations happening in the change industry, moving the industry forward. But it all really kind of begs this ultimate question of why do we care? And well, one of the biggest reasons is because organizational change does not stick. Some studies have estimated that as much as 70% of large-scale change initiatives within organizations fail to meet their long-term goals. And one of the reasons is because people resist change and organizations fail to consider that people side of change. And when we fail to consider the characteristics about the people involved in the change, such as how they like to approach change, what sort of emotional reactions they might have to change, that's when you're going to get that change resistance and ultimately change failure. So how can we start considering the people aspect of change? One major way is by understanding at its core how people prefer to approach change. And we know that people prefer to approach change in different ways. And one really neat model for understanding how people prefer to approach change is the change style indicator model. So the change style indicator model, or the CSI model, as you'll probably hear me talk about it, it is built upon 30 years of research and refinement, and it assesses people's preferred approach of dealing with change. It is based on a model that recognizes people do have varied responses to change, and it has a really long history of being adopted by organizations and coaches for its focus on the human element of change management. So within this model, there is an assessment that people can take that will tell them what their change style preference is. So I've thrown an example item up there just to give you a flavor of the types of questions. So an example item there is, I honor tradition and I do not follow tradition. Test takers have to distribute 3 points between these two statements, with higher numbers meaning it more accurately describes them. So for example, if I put a 3 beside I honor tradition, I would automatically have to indicate a 0 for I do not follow tradition. So this is called a forced choice format. And this design really eliminates any neutrality and it compels individuals to make it a true choice. So it really kind of gets rid of that social desirability bias, and it enhances the accuracy of insights about a person's natural tendencies during change. So according to the CSI model, change preference can be represented on this continuum here, and there are 3 main change styles. So we have conservers, pragmatists, and originators. And these styles are each linked to different cognitive approaches, and they represent distinct approaches when responding to change. There is absolutely no superior style or right place to be on the continuum. If you were to take the assessment, you get placed somewhere. And the further you are to the left-hand side of the continuum, the stronger your conserver tendencies. And the further you are to the right-hand side of the continuum, the more originator tendencies you have. So what does this actually mean? I'm saying conserver, pragmatist, originator. Let's break down what those change style preferences mean. So conservers are the people who accept the structure. They prefer gradual change that is really incremental. Pragmatists like to explore the structure. They prefer change that is functional. And then finally, originators, they challenge the structure. They prefer change that is expansive. So what this means kind of more simply is that conservers encourage building on what is already working. Pragmatists encourage looking at the current circumstances. And originators encourage exploring new possibilities. So what about when facing change? What do these change preferences look like? Conservers, they generally appear quite deliberate, disciplined, organized. They enjoy predictability and they'll often focus on the details of situations and the routines that often happen within their role. And they honor tradition and established practice. So they really know how things have been done and they like to sometimes stay with what has been done. Pragmatists, they generally appear kind of practical, agreeable, flexible, and they prefer change that emphasizes workable outcomes. So it's not about whether it's been done before or not, it's how do we get to a workable solution. And they tend to take more of a balanced approach. And then finally, originators, they generally appear visionary and systemic in their thinking. So they are the big thinkers. They enjoy risk and uncertainty, and they will likely challenge established rules, policies, and structures. And each of these styles has its strengths within an organization and roles. So conservers, they have a really strong attention to details and facts. And because they have such an intricate understanding of how everything works, because they love details, they can often be the first ones to detect problems. They also have really strong follow-through skills and are often the ones that get things done on time. Pragmatists, they are really, really good at building trust and rapport amongst a group of people. They're really good at drawing people together around a common purpose, and they love to utilize the expertise of others. And then finally, originators. They make decisions with less than adequate information, which is definitely a skill. They're really comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. Sometimes they thrive in those types of situations. And they really push the organization to see the big picture. So despite all of these strengths and wonderful things, as you can imagine, there are also some challenges that are associated with each of these change style preferences. So conservers, they can sometimes be a little bit rigid in their thought and action. Like we talked about, they're content with existing procedures, policies, and authority. So that may discourage innovation. Pragmatists may over-focus on balancing needs, and so that means it takes longer to make decisions. So remember, they love to bring everyone in, they love to be the bridge and kind of bring people around a common problem. But that means the more people you have, the longer it's going to take to get anywhere and make decisions. They may also negotiate compromise that is too middle of the road. So because they're getting so many different people's opinions on the change, you may actually end up with a compromise that nobody is happy with. And then finally, originators, they lack attention to detail, and they move on to new projects or ideas without completing those that are already started. They also may ignore the impact of their ideas on systems or other people. So that's kind of a brief overview of the three change styles. And often when we talk about change styles, people are quite curious about the percentage breakdown of each of these change styles in larger groups. And we looked at data from over 96,000 people who had taken the change style indicator assessment. And we found that conservers who score between 60 and 9 on the left-hand side of the continuum represent about 36% of the population. Next are the pragmatists. This is the largest group, and they make up about 47% of the population. And then finally, on the far right of the continuum, with scores from 9 to 60, we have the originators, who represent about 17% of the population. So now that we've explored the CSI2 model and we have some insight into what those three main change style preferences are, let's address some common misconceptions that often arise when discussing these styles. So first and foremost, the CSI2 styles are not about ranking or hierarchy. These styles are, again, just simply linked to different cognitive preferences for responding to change, each with its own strengths and challenges. Another important point is that the CSI2 does not measure how effective you are at managing change. Instead, it provides insight into your preference, so how you naturally approach and engage with change. So I like to think of it as a default setting, but not your overall capability. And then finally, there is no single style that's better or more effective than the other. So whether you are a conserver, a pragmatist, an originator, all styles are equally valuable and necessary in an organization. So it's not about being at a specific spot on the continuum. And just to showcase this a little bit, I'm just going to show you a little bit of data. I couldn't be an R&D and just not show you a little bit of fun stats. So we ran a series of studies where we had people complete the CSI and some other key measures of emotional intelligence, resiliency, and flexibility. And what we found is that there was little to no relationship whatsoever between people's change style preference and their emotional intelligence levels, their resiliency levels, or their flexibility. So kind of what this means is that no change style preference is limited in their capacity to demonstrate positive workplace behaviors. So all change styles can be very emotionally intelligent, they can be resilient, and they can be flexible. So again, really kind of showcasing that there is no superior change style. All are wonderful. So we've seen thousands of organizations implement the change style indicator model in their change initiatives. And beyond. And so to give you a sense of where people have been using it, just want to highlight a couple of key applications. So many organizations use the model during organizational transitions and during change management initiatives. So organizations will often measure the change style preferences of their people, which can really help to guide the strategies for managing transitions. We've also seen it used in selection contexts, so it can assist in identifying candidates whose change style aligns with team needs. We see it used a lot in leadership development. So understanding change style preferences can provide leaders with insights to help manage change and lead their teams effectively through change. And then finally, we've seen it a lot, and internal to our organization, we use it a lot for team development. So it can really help improve team dynamics by helping members understand each other's change styles. So what we're going to do next is we're going to focus here on the leadership application a little bit more, leadership development application. So I like to think about the impact of change styles on leadership in three separate but related ways. So the first is this one at the top of the circle here, and that is that leaders are responsible for leading team members through change. As we talked about a little bit earlier, it is now the expectation that leaders are change management agents. Their ability to do this well is going to depend on the other two factors that you see in the circle there. So their own leadership style and the change style of their team members. So in terms of a leader's change style, the change style they bring to work is going to impact how they interact with their direct reports. And a good leader will be able to adapt their change style depending on the situation, as well as the team members' change styles, which is that third factor here. So I'm going to talk through each of these points in a little bit more, starting with this more broad topic of leading team members through change. So the ability to empathetically guide employees through change is a necessary skill for managers. As we talked about, managers are expected to be these change agents, expected to help their teams through change, whether that's a small change like implementing a new technology within the team, or a big change like a huge organizational restructure. And so some general coaching tips for leading teams through change is that leaders, the first one there, leaders need to accept that resistance is normal and stay curious about why their team members are resisting. So we don't want leaders to take the approach of, well, that's just the way it is, so accept it, or, well, that's just what senior leadership said, so that's the end of it. Leaders want to be asking open questions to really understand the point of view of the team members and why they might be resisting that change. We also want leaders to listen actively and empathetically. If a team member says that they are struggling with a new change in the team, such as a new process, we don't want leaders to just solve the problems. We want the leader to understand what the struggle is and try and understand what exactly it is that they are truly struggling with. What is the why underneath that struggle? And finally, we encourage leaders to be authentic and genuine in their communication, especially when it comes to change. So if a leader doesn't know the answer to why a change is happening, which, let's face it, sometimes that happens, say, I don't know, but I'll try and get you an answer. As much as possible, we want to avoid corporate jargon and encourage really authentic communication with the team, especially when it comes to change. So returning to our circle of change styles and leadership, we just looked through some of the broad tips for leading team members through change. I want to go another layer deeper here and look at how a leader's own change style might show up in how they lead a team. So let's start with conservers here. So how might a conserver show up as a leader? Well, as a leader, they are going to thoroughly consider all changes, and they're going to explain them in detail to their team. What this might sound like in practice: there's been a change in our project plan, and I'm going to email you all the details and the impact on your current work. So really kind of explaining the details of whatever that change is. They also expect compliance with organizational policies, procedures, and rules. This might sound like, can you please investigate what the organizational policy is around this topic and any limits that we have to work within? So what is already currently existing, and what might we have to be aware of? When a team member suggests new ideas, a conserver leader might seem hesitant or dismissing. So this could sound like, have you thought about the impact on other teams? What about X, Y, and Z? And this one is a big one for conserver leaders to be aware of. When someone brings you an idea, how do you not instantly jump down that line of thinking of, okay, but it's going to impact this and this and this and this, and truly just trying to be more open to hearing those ideas. When it comes to pragmatists, those leaders are going to carefully assess the practical advantages of change and ensure the team understands them. So this might sound like, you know what, there's been a proposed change to the project. Let's put together a pros and cons list of the change and how it impacts our team. They are going to adapt past experiences to solve current problems. This might sound like, how have we solved this in the past? Is there anything we can use from that experience to solve this current problem? And then finally, when team members suggest new ideas, a pragmatist leader might take too much time to evaluate because they want to reach a consensus. So this may sound like, can you check with the other teams who are impacted how they feel about this new idea? So again, remembering that one of the challenges of a pragmatist is that sometimes they try and include so many people that it often delays decision making. So you can also see that in a pragmatist leader. And then finally, our originator leaders, how do they show up? They are catalysts for significant change. So let's try and do this in a completely different way. Let's blue sky this. They provide long-term vision and perspective. So where does this lead us to long-term? What do you imagine this looking like in 5 years? And then finally, when team members suggest new ideas, they are embraced, but perhaps the details are not fully thought through. So you might catch an originator leader saying, great idea, let's make it happen. Okay, but we haven't thought through A, B, C, D. So leaders are going to show up with their own change style, and you're going to see that in their leadership style. But like we talked a little bit about before, a person's change style is just their default setting. They are capable of putting on different change style hats, as I like to call them. And this is probably one of the most practical things to come out of this model. So leaders will all have a typical change style, but effective leaders will adjust to the situation at hand. So as an example, if an organization is undergoing minor changes or adjustments and it's really about maintaining stability and continuity in the market, the best leadership type for that type of organization is going to be a conserver style. In contrast, if an organization is needing to streamline processes to implement practical changes, improve efficiency, pragmatist style, is going to be really effective there. And then finally, if an organization is seeking to innovate or undergo transformative change, having leaders take on the originator style in some of the roles is going to be really imperative there. So really effective leaders will be able to adjust their change style depending on the demands of the situation and what the organization needs. So again, good leaders will be able to adjust their change style as well to their team members' change styles. So not just the situation, but also the team members' change styles. So let's dig into that one a little bit more too. Different change styles require different information from their leaders. A good leader will be able to tailor their message and communication to the change styles of their team members. So this can be done at an organizational level. So think of a CEO delivering information about a change and how knowing the change style makeup of that entire organization might impact how the CEO delivers that message. It can also be done at a manager level too, though, where a manager will cater their message directly to the team member's change style. So some practical examples and tips here that leaders can use to communicate with different change styles. So when leaders are communicating with conservers, do not start by presenting the big picture. You have to gradually build up to the larger context of that change. Also, share the details of that change. Remember, conservers are detail-oriented. They want to understand how this is going to impact all of these different parts of their role. And so you need to share the details of the change. For leaders that are communicating with pragmatists, speak in terms of outcomes and benefits of the change. Highlight real-world examples to illustrate the impact of the change. And then finally, for originators, frame discussions around future possibilities and opportunities. Ask them to articulate their desired outcomes or visions for the future. So that was a lot of talk about leaders and change styles, and hopefully you have a better understanding of how change style preferences show up in leadership in terms of the impact a leader's change style can have on how they lead, and also how good leaders should be able to adjust their change style depending on situational demands, but also based on the team members and the sort of information that they are going to need to work through a change. So as our last main section of this talk, I'm going to move on to this last application here, which is team development. And so why are change styles important when it comes to team development? Well, first, when teams understand and address the common issues and disagreements between different change styles, of course, teams can work together more efficiently. Valuing different strengths that each change style brings helps us respect different views and how we can solve problems. And the strongest teams use the strengths of each change style to complement the others. So this is all great, but how do you get teams to engage and understand the value of different change styles? I'm going to tell you about one of the activities that we do at our organization that helps bring these concepts to life and gets teams talking about change styles and appreciating working with people that have diverse change style. The activity is called the horseshoe activity. And for the horseshoe activity, the basis of it is that you take the continuum and you bend it like a horseshoe shape. So everyone who is participating in this activity takes the assessment beforehand and they know what their score is. And the facilitator of the activity then gets all of the participants to arrange themselves in that horseshoe shape, depending on their score. So on one side of the horseshoe, you're going to have your group's strongest conservers. And on the other end of the horseshoe, you're going to have your group's strongest originators. For some additional context, I have done this with groups of 20. I've also done it with groups of 150. We have done it with intact teams that work together day to day. We've also done it organization-wide, so people that don't necessarily work together every single day. Once you get them into that horseshoe shape, which is often a fun activity in and of itself, you'll often hear some immediate reactions of course, I knew that person would be over there, or whoa, look at that team. They're full of originators over there. So you kind of get to see those gut reactions that people are having. And once everyone gets settled in, the facilitator can do a big group debrief, and you start asking questions like, what stands out to you as you look around the horseshoe? You'll get people saying, wow, there's a lot of marketing people over there, and there's a lot of R&D people over there, or I didn't expect that person to be there. Is anyone surprised by their own score? Sometimes people will say, I thought I was going to be an originator. I'm on pragmatist. Is anyone surprised by anyone else's score? That's often a fun one. What do you appreciate about the other styles? What tips would you offer the other change style preferences to help you work together more effectively? As a team, what strengths do you have to leverage? And what do you find challenging about the other styles? So depending on the size of the group, you can ask all of these questions and have a big group discussion. You can also have them make little groups within their change style and pick out a couple of questions and have them go back and discuss and nominate someone to come back to the larger group. I'm going to go over some of my favorite questions. One of my favorite questions is, what do you appreciate about the other styles? And it's always really fun to see how quickly change styles can recognize the strengths of change styles that are not their own. So some of the most common answers we usually get in response to this question are, for conservers, people really appreciate that they can set realistic priorities and timelines and they complete tasks on time. People appreciate that they focus on relevant facts and details and that they safeguard and oversee the organization's resources. For pragmatists, people really appreciate that they advocate for negotiation and cooperation to resolve issue. They're really good, like we've talked about drawing people together around a common purpose, and they can translate ideas into an actionable plan. And then finally, for originators, people really appreciate that they create innovative solutions to problems. They support taking risks, sometimes causing other people who wouldn't take a risk to maybe take a risk, and leading change. And they are really often future focused, and they offer those future focused ideas and vision, and other people really see that. One of my other favorite questions is this one here, which is, what do you find challenging about the other styles? And so some common themes that come up, well, conservers, sometimes you're stubborn and sometimes you rely so heavily on administrative procedures. You're unaware of competitive demands, you're unwilling to move quickly, and you're less inclined towards innovation. So this is how they are sometimes perceived by their pragmatists and originator counterparts. Pragmatists, they sometimes can be seen as mediating. They lack firmness or clarity in their making, and when they are making choices. They're easily influenced. They may hesitate to take a definite position or stance on something, and they're reluctant to confront issues directly. And originators, sometimes they're seen as impulsive, unfocused. They can't look at the details. They're ignoring the details. Sometimes they're perceived as starting but not finishing projects. So really good at coming up with those ideas, but when it comes to the execution part, perhaps they're perceived as not being so great at that. Sometimes they're perceived as wanting change for the sake of change, or not understanding how things really get done. This is one of the most revealing questions in the group debrief, and it often results in the other change styles kind of having that aha moment of, oh, that's how I come across in some of these situations. And I can remember a time when I came across as stubborn as a conserver, or as an originator, that I was starting projects and not finishing it. So this is where a really light bulb moment often happens for teams. And really the purpose behind this activity is to get team members to appreciate the value that they bring to the team and the potential blind spots that they have about their styles, as well as to appreciate the other change styles that they work with. So this is such a great activity for exploring diversity of thought and really getting people to think about how they are approaching situations versus others and what that impact might be. So oftentimes in our organization, you'll hear people come to a conversation or a meeting with, oh, this could be the conserver in me, recognizing that they may have a blind spot to expose, or I have an originator type of idea, but I need a conserver to keep me in check. So really easily leaning into the concepts and ideas of the change style model and applying it to the roles within the organization. At the end of the day, what we want people to get from this horseshoe activity is that if you have similar change styles all working together, blind spots will be unchallenged, and there will be inferior results because there are blind spots. But if you have a team with different change styles, or a team that is at least aware of their change styles, those blind spots will be challenged and you will get better results. So we really want the change styles to realize, the different change styles to realize that they can leverage each other's strengths in their day-to-day work. So for example, we want to seek the following from conservers. As a tip, verify with a conserver that you are understanding at least 5 facts about that situation or the problem. Remember, our conservers are detail-oriented. They know a lot of information. If you're not a conserver, verify with a conserver that you're reading the situation right and you understand what those details are. Pragmatist. Ask a pragmatist to talk through the benefits of taking prompt action versus taking longer to decide with a problem you're facing. Pragmatists are going to be really good at laying out the pros and the cons, and you can utilize that with a pragmatist change style to help you make a better decision. And then finally, from originators, when you are considering long-term potential of a change, ask an originator to explore creative possibilities and innovative ideas for what that future could look like. If you know you're typically a conserver, check your ideas with an originator. Say, how can I go beyond this idea? How do I think more blue sky? What could the future look like that I'm not thinking of here? So really to wrap up everything today, three main messages I want you to take home. The first is that change style preferences are a really powerful and intuitive way to frame change discussions within any organization and bring the people side to change management. You can run an hour and a half horseshoe activity, and at the end of that horseshoe activity, people will be using the language of the change style model, and it becomes a common language within the organization. Leaders who understand their own and their team members' change styles can more effectively manage change and lead their teams more productively. And then finally, understanding change styles within a team can be a really powerful way to expose team blind spots and also create a common language around teammates when addressing change. So all wonderful, wonderful things that can come out of this simple yet really, really powerful change style preference model. And that is everything for me. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed.